Hello, welcome to session ARC 206. Get started with AWS for your first few production workloads. My name is Christopher Kampmeyer, and I'm a solutions architect with Amazon Web Services. My role is to help new customers understand how they can start deriving business value through their adoption of AWS. Since you're viewing this session, I expect that you're either relatively new to AWS and are considering using AWS for production, or you're in a similar role as mine where you help your customers start gaining value from AWS. As a solutions architect, I work with customers like you to get your initial AWS environment set up so that you can get your first few proof of value solutions into production. In these situations, you often have a business need that you want to address quickly. You need to prove the value of using AWS while also gaining practical experience of operating in the cloud. In my role, I help you translate your business needs into an architecture that makes the best use of AWS so that your work is minimized and you can more quickly realize business benefits. Naturally, your focus is primarily on getting a solution into production so that your customers can benefit. But what about the overall environment in which your initial solutions will operate? In other words, what about those foundational capabilities that are needed in your environment to support deployment of your business-oriented solutions? Now, in your on-premises environment, you probably have a lot of foundational capabilities. For example, your operations team might manage a set of overall hosting environments to separate your development, test, and production applications and data. Your networking team manages networks, IP address ranges, firewalls, routers, and load balancers. Your security team manages access control, identity management systems, encryption and certificate management services. Finally, your finance team, as an example, does its best to associate infrastructure spend with your business services. Your requirements for these capabilities still apply in the cloud, but how you realize them is different. Even in support of your first few production workloads, you'll need to address these types of capabilities. When I discuss these capabilities with my customers, they often say to me, "Chris, for these common capabilities, we don't want to be presented with a lot of options. We just want your guidance. Tell us what to do based on your experiences with many other customers." Again, your primary focus is on the business value that your solutions can bring. Everything else is a means to that end. The less time you spend on undifferentiated heavy lifting, the more time you can invest in meeting your business needs. So my colleagues and I, who help new customers adopt AWS, heard this message loud and clear. Now, is there an easy button to get your initial end-to-end foundation set up to meet these needs? No, not yet. However, we have created a guided workshop that provides prescriptive, step-by-step instructions that leverages the latest AWS services and features that, when combined, will help you quickly establish your initial AWS environment. By doing so, you'll not only speed the delivery of your first several proof-of-value solutions, but you'll do it in a way that establishes a well-architected, durable foundation that you can evolve to support more business needs over time. In this session, I'll be providing a tour of the new guided workshop. But before we provide a tour of the guide, let's start with some background on the typical customer needs and challenges. Let's start with a zoomed-out view of the typical stages of customers adopting AWS. On the left, we start with the project stage of adoption. It's a stage in which you may have already run some non-production experiments or prototypes, but you want to progress a step further by proving their value in production. This is the stage that we're going to focus on today. Later, once you gain more confidence in AWS and your ability to realize business value, you would typically invest in expanding the initial cloud foundation capabilities so that you can more rapidly gain more value from AWS. Whether this is in the form of large-scale data center migrations or net new cloud-native applications, the foundation stage is a critical point at which to prepare for this expansion. As you transform how you work, coupled with your use of AWS, you eventually achieve a new normal of rapid iterations in support of a variety of business needs. Depending on the size of your organization and the size of the portfolio of your applications and solutions, this journey can take several years. But, in the words of Jeff Bezos, the founder and CEO of Amazon, big things start small. The guided workshop that we're introducing in this session is focused on that project stage of adoption and you moving from prototyping and experimentation to actually running your first few proof of value workloads in production. In this project stage of adoption, your goal may be to quickly demonstrate business value through the use of cloud and AWS, perhaps in as little as a few weeks' time. You want to get proof of value solutions into production, get feedback from your customers, and quickly iterate. During this time, your teams will want to start gaining the experience of operating in the cloud so that you can better understand the benefits and implications of doing so. The guided workshop is intended to help your team more quickly get your first few proof of value solutions into production. Your initial proof of value solution is something that we call a workload. A workload identifies a set of technical components that, working together, deliver business value. A workload is usually the level of detail that your business and technology leaders communicate about. Workloads vary widely in architectural complexity, anything from ranging from static websites to architectures with multiple data sources and many components. Your first several proof of value workloads could be of any type. These are just common examples of workloads that you might deploy to AWS. We provide over 175 services that make it easier to meet your business needs. Solution architects like me and AWS Partners can help you quickly understand which AWS services and partner solutions can best meet your needs of your workloads. But that's not enough. As we discussed at the outset, just focusing on the workloads isn't sufficient. Your workloads need an initial foundation or overall environment in which to operate. For example, your security teams will need to provide secure, role-based access to your AWS environment and to your workloads. Your business-oriented teams need a way to safely experiment, develop, and test changes to their workloads without impacting their production environments. Your workloads might need connectivity to network services running in your on-premises environment. You'll need to learn about cost management in the cloud so that you can minimize spend and maximize value. These are just a few examples of foundational capabilities that apply across a wide variety of workload types. AWS services help remove a lot of the burden of establishing and managing these overall environments. But you'll need to understand which services and features to use to establish and evolve your own AWS environment. As business initiatives come and go and the types of workloads change, your underlying cloud foundation is intended to be a durable, yet evolutionary platform on which you can deploy your workloads. So, how can you get started on establishing your initial foundation or your initial AWS environment in support of those first few production workloads? Well, there's a vast array of AWS-oriented technical workshops, AWS services documentation, and online cloud learning services that can help you learn about specific facets of setting up an AWS environment and your supporting workloads. However, these resources are great for helping you dive into specific capabilities, but my colleagues and I weren't able to share with new customers a prescriptive end-to-end guide so that customers could more easily set up their initial AWS environments. To help fill this gap, we've developed a Getting Started guided workshop to help you quickly establish your initial foundation. An initial foundation on top of which you can develop, test, deploy, and operate your initial proof of value workloads. If you have the skills and time, the guided workshop is intended to help you set up your initial foundation in a self-service manner. A core tenet of the guide is to provide a prescriptive end-to-end set of instructions in the context of a reference configuration. As your requirements dictate, you might choose to defer or skip establishing some of the capabilities at this early stage. Let's take a tour of the guided workshop.
Okay, so let's take a brief tour of the Getting Started guide. First, note that the URL is getstarted.awsworkshop.io. Now, this guide is actually a static website generated using the Hugo static site generation framework. As you'll note on the bottom left of this guide, there's a GitHub project. The Git repository behind that project and behind the guide contains all of the markdown files that represent the documentation of the guide. And there's an internal build process to use Hugo to actually generate and publish the site. The site's actually delivered through Amazon CloudFront, and it's hosted on Amazon S3. Let's talk about the structure of the site. So, the site is very much structured based on a top-down approach to helping you set up your initial foundation in AWS. First, there's an introduction section to help set the stage and help you make an informed decision about whether or not the guide will meet your needs. Then, if it looks like the guide is appropriate for your needs, there's a series of upfront tasks that you should take care of before diving into the actual setup steps. Then, the guide leads you through setting up your base foundation. On top of that, the guide will walk you through setting up a development environment or a series of development environments, depending on your need, and then setting up your initial test and production environments for your initial workloads. Then, depending on your needs, the guide will walk through a set of common, popular capabilities that may apply even in this early stage of your use of AWS. Finally, there's some information about the project itself, information that helps you understand what the content and the criteria is for getting content and capabilities into the scope of the guide. So let's look at the introduction. Now, we've already positioned the role of this guide in support of your needs. Let's talk about a few other things that we haven't talked about. So number one is the intended audience. You may have just one or two technologists who will be responsible for establishing and maintaining your initial AWS environment. This guide is built for those technologists. Those technologists may be part of the business unit that owns the initial workloads that you're getting into production, or those technologists might be part of your centralized IT team. The guide also outlines knowledge requirements that those technologists should be comfortable in addressing. The guide also provides references to AWS training and certification and a series of free of charge ramp-up guides that can help those technologists fill any knowledge gaps that they might have. Okay, so once you've determined that the guide is a fit for your use case, what do you do next? Well, you start with a set of upfront tasks. So overall, this section helps position the typical requirements of your foundational AWS environment in support of your initial proof of value workloads in production. So that superset of requirements may not all apply to your use case. So you can kind of pick and choose which capabilities and the extent of those capabilities that are appropriate for your initial workloads. An important part is to start mapping the people involved and the people who will need access to your AWS environment. Start mapping those to a series of functional roles so that you can have segregated access to your AWS environment. Importantly, there's a set of technical prerequisites that you should take care of up front before you actually start building out your environment. A few to note are obtaining a series of email addresses. We recommend distribution lists or shared mailboxes because you'll need a unique email address for each AWS account that's created as part of setting up your environment. In some organizations, getting an email distribution list can take days, so we recommend planning and preparing for that in advance. Similarly, the guide helps you understand if your workloads need networking support. The guide helps you understand what size of IP address range would be appropriate to try to obtain for your networking team. Again, since this typically involves discussions with a team that's external to you, we recommend that you do this up front so you can reduce the time required later on. Once you've satisfied some of those initial upfront requirements, then it's time to dive in and start setting up your environment. So a key AWS service that's used to help you set up your foundational environment is AWS Control Tower. This section is primarily concerned with starting to use AWS Control Tower to set up your initial few AWS accounts and prepare your environment for access by your initial foundation team or those initial technologists who are going to support and maintain your AWS environment. This section also leads you through structuring your AWS accounts depending on the scope of your environment. So for example, in this picture, it shows a test and workload production companion set of environments. But you'll note in this scenario, there's no development environment. You may or may not have a need for a development environment starting out. If you're setting up a development environment, we recommend you set up a development account for your infrastructure or cloud foundation team, and then for that first team that's going to own the initial workloads that are going to go into production. Once you've onboarded your foundation team to give them appropriate functional role-based access to your environment, now it's time to set up your development environment. Now again, we highly recommend that you set up development environments even if you don't have traditional application development teams. There's always a need for your technologists or builders to be able to experiment and iterate on the configuration of their workloads in a safe way, and very much before your more formally controlled test and production environments. So if you choose to set up development environments, this section leads you through the overall solution, setting up a development network, setting up some security and operational guardrails so that your builders, your technologists can safely experiment without being able to inadvertently modify the underlying foundation. And then once you set up your series of development accounts or environments, then it's time to onboard your builder teams. Now, we refer to builder as any one of your technologists, whether they're from the Cloud Foundation team or they own a workload. They're all technologists that will use AWS in different ways to help meet your needs. So one thing that's special about this guide is that it actually provides an embedded getting started guide for your builder teams. So this document is more of a template that's intended to be copied into your own internal wiki so that you can start building out a getting started guide for your builder teams. Next, after your builder teams are onboarded to your development environments, the guide walks you through setting up the test and production environments. Again, a very similar pattern here. The guide will walk you through reviewing the solution, setting up some security and operational guardrails that might be different from your development environment guardrails, and then setting up access controls for your test and production environment. Now, in this case, the access controls aren't so much for your development purposes, but they're for deploying and operating workloads. So in this case, the guide goes through detail in setting up a workload administrator set of permissions. The workload administrator set of permissions may be granted to just a subset of your team members who are trusted and are responsible for deploying and operating your workloads in production. If you have networking needs for your test and production environments, the guide helps you set up those dedicated networks. To get a sense of the detail that this guide goes into, it's very much step by step. So you'll see that down below here, provision and production workload VPC, it takes you through the console to set up your production workload VPC. Now, it's not all clickety-click through the console. For example, in this case, it defers to another sample CloudFormation template or infrastructure as code resource to help make it easy to set up a multi-tier, multi-subnet VPC or virtual network in your environment. Finally, much like the development section, onboarding your workload admins is the last step in the initial setup of your test and production environments. Now, you may have needs that go beyond what's covered in sections 2, 3, and 4. The most common additional needs are connecting your AWS networking environment to your on-premises network, and number 2, reusing one of your identity sources to help you control, based on your enterprise RBAC processes, control access to your new AWS environment. So let's look at those briefly. With hybrid networking, the guide walks you through the use cases that typically are involved in motivating you to connect your AWS network environment to your on-premise network environment. Then the guide leads you through the common solutions for setting up that connectivity. Eventually, you may need the more sophisticated and capable features of AWS Direct Connect, but since it takes a longer lead time to set up AWS Direct Connect, we recommend that you start with AWS site-to-site VPN connection. So the guide dives into a VPN architecture and leads you through the main considerations of setting up that type of integration. Once you've reviewed the architecture, then the guide deep dives into the actual setup steps. Before doing so, it walks you through the detailed setup. So you'll notice in this description that you have a production environment on the upper right, test environment in the middle right, and on the lower right, you have your development environments. You'll note here that the way that networking is configured through the Getting Started guide is that these networks will not be able to talk to each other. And that's a typical requirement from your security team. Yet, if you had a set of infrastructure shared services, so for example, hybrid DNS capabilities, then you may have a shared services environment that those other environments may need to access. Again, the overall configuration here set up through the Getting Started guide enables that type of integration, but maintaining secure partitioning or segmentation between your actual hosting environments. The other section that covers a common optional capability is reusing an existing identity source for controlling access to your AWS platform. This section helps you understand the benefits of doing so, and then it leads you through some of your options. Depending on your starting point and your requirements, you may go down a different path in this decision tree than other customers. In support of each path and your selected path, the guide goes into the details of helping you set up that type of integration. Finally, as mentioned earlier, you have project information. So a key part of this are the project tenants. So by reading through the project tenants, you'll understand what's important to us as a project team to consider when we're looking at putting content and addressing capabilities in the guide. So we encourage you to look at the project tenants. Finally, the GitHub project sits behind the guide. This is where all the actual source content and documentation files exist. Most notably, the content directory contains all of the markdown files that make up the site that we just toured. If you'd like to contribute to the guide, review the contributing.md file for all of those instructions. So that completes our walkthrough of the Getting Started guide. Hopefully you find that instructive and that helps you better understand the breadth and depth of the guide.
Now that we've taken the tour of the guided workshop, hopefully you'll have a little bit better understanding of the breadth and depth and how it can meet your needs in setting up an initial environment. Now, we've started sharing this guided workshop with a few customers. It's basically in pilot mode as we speak. Initial impressions are positive, but we're interested in getting more feedback so that we can make it even easier for you to get your first few workloads into production. For example, we'd like to hear from you, is the initial set of foundational capabilities addressed by the guide sufficient to support the workloads that you're most interested in? Are there areas for which you'd like more prescriptive guidance? Finally, does any of the guidance conflict with your own organization's requirements? One area that we have received feedback on as we piloted the guide is that customers who already have an AWS environment are interested in comparing their current state with the latest guidance and AWS features. For example, those customers may be managing users and groups in AWS Identity and Access Management, or IAM, within each AWS account, rather than managing users and groups centrally and providing teams with federated access to their AWS environments. The guided workshop shows you how to set up the latter capability. These customers may choose to make enhancements in place to their existing environment, or they may choose to set up a parallel new environment and migrate existing accounts to their new environment. Another feedback topic we received is that the guided workshop can be used for self-paced learning. Similarly, the end-to-end reference environment established by following the guided workshop provides a great basis to demonstrate AWS services and features. If you're in the business of helping your customers learn about AWS, then you might find value in using the guide to support these needs. I hope this introduction demonstrated how the guided workshop can help you spend less time figuring out the underlying foundation of your AWS environment so that you can devote more time to delivering business value to your customers. Whether you're an AWS customer who's looking to get your first few proof of value workloads into production, or just want to learn more about setting up a suitable foundation so that you can better support your customers, we look forward to hearing your feedback. Also, if you're interested in helping to evolve the guide and/or you find some bugs in it, pull requests are welcome. For a link to the guide and a link to the GitHub project, see the online guide. Thank you.